He once stood on the mound in Major League Baseball stadiums, thousands of fans chanting his name. He had the money, the fame, the future every young athlete dreams of. But somewhere along the way, Daniel Serafini lost everything: his career, his fortune, his dignity. And in a desperate attempt to reclaim what he believed he deserved, he would commit an act so cold, so calculated, that it would destroy not one family, but two. This is the story of how a celebrated pitcher became a cold-blooded killer, and how a single piece of surveillance footage would eventually bring him down. But before we get to that chilling video of a hooded figure stalking toward a lakeside mansion, we need to understand the man behind the mask. Because Daniel Serafini wasn't born a monster, he was made into one. And understanding how requires going back to the very beginning, to a time when the future seemed limitless and failure seemed impossible. Born in San Francisco, Daniel Serafini discovered his love for baseball as a teenager, and he wasn't just good, he was exceptional. The kind of talent that scouts travel across the country to see, that coaches build entire teams around, that journalists write about in glowing profiles predicting Hall of Fame careers. By his early 20s, he had achieved what millions of young athletes only dream of: a spot in Major League Baseball, the pinnacle, the show, the place where childhood dreams become reality and bank accounts overflow with more money than most people see in a lifetime. He pitched for top-tier American teams, standing on mounds in front of screaming crowds. He crossed the Pacific to play in the prestigious Japanese Professional Baseball League, where American players are treated like royalty and paid handsomely for their talents. At 31 years old, Daniel Serafini was living the American dream in its purest, most intoxicating form. Magazine features, fat paychecks, endorsement deals, the VIP lifestyle of a professional athlete who believed with the confidence of youth that the good times would never end. But here's something you need to understand about professional sports, something they never tell you when you're signing that first contract. Careers are brutally short, and fortunes disappear faster than you'd ever think possible. The average MLB career lasts just 5.6 years. Most players are out of the game before they turn 30, with decades of life still ahead of them and skills that don't translate to normal jobs. And Daniel? He played hard, both on and off the field. As he himself admitted in interviews, he liked to gamble big. He liked to live large. He spent money like it would never stop flowing. So, what happens when a man who's had everything suddenly has nothing? What happens when the cheering stops, when the contracts dry up, when the phone stops ringing, and when the bills keep piling higher and higher? That's where our story truly begins. And trust me, it gets much darker from here. In 2007, Daniel's world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. He tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs during a routine screening. He claimed Japanese doctors had recommended the substance for legitimate medical purposes, but Major League Baseball didn't care about explanations. Rules were rules. The league suspended him for 50 games, and just like that, the Golden Boy became damaged goods. Teams that once fought to sign him now wouldn't return his phone calls. His reputation was destroyed overnight. What followed was a downward spiral that would have broken most men completely. Minor league teams where the pay was a fraction of what he'd known, and the stadiums were half empty. Failed investments that consumed whatever savings remained. A bar business he'd poured his money into that hemorrhaged cash month after month until there was nothing left to lose. And debt. Mountains and mountains of debt that eventually climbed to a staggering $14 million. Let that number sink in for a moment. $14 million in the red. Can you even imagine the pressure of that weight pressing down on you every single day? The constant phone calls from creditors, the legal threats piling up in your mailbox, the shame of having fallen so far from where you once stood. His own parents, who had once watched their son with such pride from the stadium stands, mortgaged their family home to give him $240,000. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The hole was simply too deep, and Daniel kept digging deeper with every failed scheme and bad investment. His first marriage crumbled under the crushing financial pressure. How could any relationship survive when every conversation eventually turned to money, to debt, to desperation? Divorced and broken, Daniel moved to Nevada, a shell of the man he used to be. The stadiums were gone. The cheering crowds were gone. The future he'd envisioned had evaporated like morning dew. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that seemed at first like salvation, but would eventually reveal itself to be the first step toward murder. A mutual friend gave him a phone number, just 10 digits that would change the course of multiple lives forever. The number belonged to Erin Spoor, a young woman Daniel had met years earlier when she worked as a horse trainer for his family. She was 19 when they first crossed paths, passionate about equestrian sports and still finding her way in the world. She was also the daughter of wealthy California real estate investors Robert Gary Spoor and Wendy Wood. Now, with Daniel newly single and desperate for a fresh start, he made the call that would change everything. Erin agreed to fly from California to Nevada for a date. The romance that followed was intense and immediate, like a fire that consumes everything in its path. Within months, they were inseparable. In 2011, they exchanged vows on a Hawaiian beach as the sun set over the Pacific, and then settled into a massive 5-bedroom property in Reno, valued at $1.1 million. From the outside, it looked like Daniel had somehow landed on his feet against all odds. A beautiful wife from a good family, a stunning home in an upscale neighborhood, a chance to rebuild, to reinvent himself, to leave the failures behind. But here's where you need to pay very close attention, because this is where the cracks in the foundation began to show. This is where the seeds of everything that would come later were planted. Erin came from money, serious money, old money built over decades of smart decisions and careful investments. Her parents, Gary and Wendy, had constructed a fortune through real estate that most people can only dream about. They had lived abroad in Afghanistan and Hong Kong during the 1970s and 1980s, adventurous spirits who saw the world and invested wisely along the way. They owned multiple properties, including a breathtaking lakeside mansion in the Homewood area of Lake Tahoe, worth around $5 million. Their total estate would eventually be valued at over $23 million. And Daniel? Daniel brought nothing to the marriage but debt, shame, and a desperate, burning hunger for the lifestyle he'd lost. Do you see where this is going? Can you feel the imbalance, the dependency, the simmering resentment that would inevitably follow? From the very first meeting, Daniel's relationship with his new in-laws was tense enough to cut with a knife. Gary and Wendy Spoor were not thrilled, to put it mildly, that their daughter had dropped out of dental school after meeting this washed-up baseball player with a mountain of debt and a history of bad decisions. They had paid for that education. They had invested in their daughter's future. And now She was throwing it all away for a man who couldn't even support himself. The Spores even threatened to sue Daniel for the tuition money they'd already paid. Imagine those early family dinners. The forced smiles across the table. The uncomfortable silences that stretched on too long. The elephant in the room that everyone could see but nobody would name. Eventually, the initial anger subsided into an uneasy truce. After all, Erin seemed happy. She and Daniel had 2 children together, a boy in 2017 and another in 2020. She ran an equestrian center at their Reno property, pursuing her passion for horses. Daniel found work as an equipment operator at a remote Nevada gold mine, a far cry from the bright lights of professional baseball, but at least it was honest work. But beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family life, resentment was building like pressure in a sealed container, ready to explode at any moment. Daniel had become completely dependent on his in-laws' generosity for everything that mattered. Gary and Wendy paid for housing. They covered childcare expenses. They wrote check after check after check to keep Daniel and Erin's comfortable lifestyle afloat while their own son-in-law failed to provide. And here's the detail that prosecutors would later seize upon, the clause that would become central to understanding the motive for murder. There was a prenuptial agreement, a document signed before the wedding that clearly stated if Daniel and Erin ever divorced, he would receive absolutely nothing from the Spore family estate. Not a single cent. Zero. Everything would stay with Erin and her family. Think about that for a long moment. Really let it sink in. A man who once had millions, who once had everything, now completely dependent on people who didn't particularly like him, who looked down on him, who reminded him with every generous check exactly how far he had fallen. And if the marriage ended, he'd be right back where he started. Broke. Alone. A complete failure. Meanwhile, arguments about money became a constant background noise in both families' lives. Heated discussions about Daniel's terrible investments that kept losing money. Screaming matches about politics and lifestyle choices. Bitter disputes about a $1.3 million renovation project for the Tahoe house that Gary and Wendy wanted completed their way. The checks kept coming, and so did the resentment. And somewhere in the darkest corners of Daniel Serafini's mind, a solution began to take shape, a permanent solution to all his problems. But what no one knew was that Daniel wasn't alone in his scheming. There was someone else involved, someone disturbingly close to the family, someone who would eventually become the key to unraveling everything. Her name was Samantha Scott. She was Erin's close friend, practically family at this point, and she worked as the nanny for Daniel and Erin's 2 young children. She was in the house constantly, day after day. She knew the family's routines, their schedules, their secrets, their vulnerabilities. And at some point, she became something much more to Daniel than just the hired help. You see, Daniel and Erin had entered into what's called an open marriage, a non-traditional arrangement where both partners are allowed to pursue romantic relationships outside the marriage with each other's knowledge. A strange choice, perhaps, but one that seemed to work for them, or at least that's how they described it to others. And within that arrangement, Daniel and Samantha began a relationship that would ultimately lead straight to murder. What kind of hold did Daniel have over Samantha? What promises did he whisper in her ear? What glittering future did she believe they would share together once the obstacles were removed? Did she know when she agreed to help him exactly what she was agreeing to? Or did she only understand the full horror of the plan when it was too late to back out? These are questions worth holding in your mind as we move toward the darkest chapter of this story. It was a Saturday, Early June in California, warm and sunny with crystal blue skies stretching from horizon to horizon. The kind of perfect day that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen, like the world is fundamentally good and safe and beautiful. Erin loaded her two children, ages 3 years and 8 months, into the family truck and drove the hour-plus journey to visit her parents at the Lake Tahoe house. When they arrived at the stunning lakeside property, Gary and Wendy were overjoyed to see their grandchildren. There's something about grandchildren that can heal even the deepest family wounds. And since the boys had been born, the relationship between Wendy and Erin had improved dramatically. The family spent a glorious afternoon on the water. Gary took them sailing on the lake, the children laughing and splashing as the boat cut through the gentle waves. The sun warmed their faces. The old tension seemed to be fading under the warmth of the California sun. 3 generations together, making memories that would last a lifetime. Or so they thought. That afternoon, Wendy wrote Erin a check for $90,000, just another in the endless series of financial lifelines thrown to keep her daughter and son-in-law afloat. Only a week earlier, they had given Daniel $70,000 directly. The generosity never stopped, even as the resentment it created continued to grow on the receiving end. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, Robert went to the kitchen to cook dinner for everyone. It was peaceful. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of evening you dream about when you imagine your golden years surrounded by family. At 7:45 p.m., Erin kissed her parents goodbye, loaded the kids back into her truck, and headed home to Nevada. The headlights disappeared down the winding mountain road. But here's what no one inside that beautiful lakeside home knew. They were not alone. They hadn't been alone all day. And the nightmare was just minutes away from beginning. Earlier that day, while the Spoor family was out on the lake enjoying their perfect afternoon, surveillance cameras throughout the neighborhood captured something deeply disturbing. A figure dressed in dark clothing, face completely hidden beneath a hood and white mask, backpack strapped firmly to his shoulders, walking slowly and deliberately toward the Spoor residence. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. This was a predator who had studied his prey carefully for a long time. He knew the house intimately, every entrance and exit, every blind spot. He knew the layout, where the bedrooms were, where the family gathered in the evenings. He knew exactly when they would return from the lake and, more importantly, exactly when Erin would leave with the children. And so he waited, hidden somewhere inside or near the property, patient as a spider, sitting motionless in its web, hour after hour after hour, calculating, ready, listening to the sounds of the happy family just feet away. The family came home from the lake. They didn't notice anything wrong. How could they? Everything seemed normal. They cooked, they talked, they laughed about the day on the water. They wrote checks and discussed grandchildren and made plans for the future. And when Erin's truck disappeared down the winding road toward Nevada, carrying the children away from what was about to happen, the hooded figure made his move. What happened next took less than 2 minutes from start to finish, but those 120 seconds would destroy lives and haunt survivors for years to come. Gary Spoor was 70 years old, a man who had lived a full, adventurous life. A successful businessman who loved the ocean and sailing, who had planned scuba diving trips for his upcoming birthday, who adored his grandchildren and was looking forward to watching them grow up. He never saw his killer coming. The intruder approached from behind, completely silent, and fired. A single shot to the head. Gary collapsed near the fireplace without ever knowing who had ended his life or why. Wendy barely had time to process the horror unfolding in front of her before the attacker turned toward her. She was 68 years old, a vibrant woman who had dedicated herself to helping foreign seasonal workers at local ski resorts find housing, a good person who gave back to her community. She raised her hands instinctively, desperately trying to protect herself from the nightmare that had invaded her home. It wasn't enough. Two shots struck her head. Another tore through her hand. The weapon was a .22 caliber pistol fitted with a homemade silencer, a plastic tube crudely designed to muffle the sound. It worked well enough. Neighbors heard something strange, a dull thud that didn't quite sound right, but nothing that made them think of gunfire, nothing that made them reach for their phones to call the police. The attacker slipped out as quietly as he had entered, disappearing into the darkness. Gary Spoor, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, was dead. Wendy Wood, survivor of countless adventures across multiple continents, lay bleeding on the bathroom floor, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. And here's the detail that still haunts everyone who knows this case. It was Wendy's dog who saved her life. The family pet found her and licked her face vigorously, desperately, until she regained enough consciousness to reach for her phone. With 2 bullets in her head, somehow, impossibly, through sheer willpower, she managed to dial 911. But she couldn't speak. The operator on the other end heard only gasping, labored breathing, and then silence. When paramedics finally arrived, they found a scene that defied any logical explanation. A wealthy couple attacked in their own home, expensive jewelry completely untouched, including a Rolex still strapped to Gary's wrist and a diamond bracelet still glittering on Wendy's arm. No sign of forced entry anywhere. Nothing stolen. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a cold, premeditated execution. But by whom? And why? The peaceful Lake Tahoe community was shattered by the news. Local police hadn't investigated a murder in over 20 years. This kind of violence simply didn't happen here, in this paradise of million-dollar vacation homes and weekend boaters. Wendy survived the attack, but the road to recovery was almost impossibly brutal. 2 bullets to the head had left her with damage that would take years to overcome. She had to relearn how to walk, how to talk, how to eat. Basic functions that most of us take for granted became monumental daily challenges. And the cruelest part of all? She couldn't remember the attack. The trauma had erased those moments from her memory entirely. She couldn't identify her attacker because she had no memory of being attacked. The one witness who might have solved everything was trapped behind a wall of amnesia. Investigators had the surveillance footage of the hooded figure, but the mask and hood made identification impossible. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed everyone connected to the family. Nothing. Adrienne, the younger Spoor daughter, became the public face of the desperate search for justice. She held emotional press conferences, begging for anyone with information to come forward. She offered a $150,000 reward. Her sister Erin and brother-in-law Daniel? They were curiously absent from these public appeals. Detectives noticed something else. Daniel's cell phone, which normally generated hundreds of messages daily, had been completely turned off during the exact window of the attack. Coincidence? They didn't think so. But they couldn't prove anything. Yet. In February 2022, the case was provisionally closed. But the story was far from over. In 2023, investigators caught a break that would blow everything open. It came from motel surveillance cameras. Police discovered footage showing Daniel and Samantha checking into a Nevada motel the night before the murder. They were captured together, entering and leaving, a digital record that couldn't be explained away. Daniel's alibi began to crumble. Meanwhile, Wendy was destroyed emotionally. She suspected her own son-in-law. Worse, she harbored the agonizing suspicion that her own daughter might have been involved. The weight became too much. On March 9, 2023, Wendy Wood took her own life. She was 70 years old. But before she died, she disinherited Aaron, leaving her only half of the lake house. Even in death, Wendy was pointing a finger at her own family. On October 20, 2023, Daniel Serafini and Samantha Scott were arrested in Nevada. Daniel, the former MLB star, was found living part-time in a trailer. The fall from grace was complete. Both were charged with Gary's murder and Wendy's attempted murder. Facing life in prison, Samantha's loyalty finally cracked. On February 6, 2025, she pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Daniel. Her testimony was devastating. She described driving Daniel to Lake Tahoe, watching him test his homemade silencer, dropping him near the house and waiting for hours, picking him up after the attack, helping dispose of evidence during the drive back. They'd even exchanged love letters in prison, where he fantasized about the life they'd build once free. The 6-week trial exposed Daniel completely. Prosecutors presented furious emails to his father-in-law, described by the judge as verbally violent. Testimony that Daniel had offered $20,000 to have Gary and Wendy killed the year he married Aaron, a mine foreman who heard him say he wanted to kill his in-laws. That $70,000 check Wendy gave Daniel weeks before the attack? He used it to buy his dream car. Even Daniel's own brother admitted the hooded figure looked like Daniel. On July 14, 2025, the jury found Daniel Serafini guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and first-degree burglary. Special circumstances of lying in wait and felony murder were found true. Daniel awaits sentencing, postponed to February 20, 2026. Aaron filed for divorce 1 week after the verdict. The two sisters are locked in civil litigation over their parents' estate. Robert Gary Spoor was adventurous, generous, and loved life. Wendy Wood survived the unsurvivable, only to succumb to grief. And Daniel Serafini went from packed stadiums to prison. The surveillance footage of that hooded figure remains one of Lake Tahoe's most chilling images, a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes the monster is already inside your home. What do you think? Did Aaron know? What sentence does Daniel deserve? Let us know in the comments.